Stoicism helps you to conserve and best deploy your limited resources. If it's out of your control, trying to allocate as few calories, as few minutes, as few dollars to that as humanly possible.
I'm gonna ask Tim, and he's gonna tell me probably not to do it, and for a bunch of smart reasons. Anyways, I call you, and you're like, I think it sounds like a great idea, and you're like, but only if you think about it like this. And what you said is, don't see yourself as opening a bookstore forever. See yourself as doing a 2-year experiment running a bookstore. So decide, obviously that would sort of change how you would do some of the stuff. But your point was, think about it as an experiment. And you said, you'll only know if you want to run a bookstore. How else will you find out if you really want to run a bookstore than by opening a bookstore? And so you gave me permission to do it in a way that I could actually trust and that I didn't feel like you were. And I think just the idea of seeing doing crazy thing as an experiment or as an iterative process, as opposed to this is permanently my identity, I can never go back, and then being either intimidated by it and not doing it, or being locked into it forever if it's not working.
Totally. And if I remember correctly, and I could be manufacturing this, but I get a lot of these calls, as you might imagine. And there are people I call with my own situations where I'm like, am I stupid? Tell me, actually, I'm going to force you. What are the 5 ways if you had to steelman it that this is a terrible decision?
Yes.
Like, just take that side of the debate table. But I believe that also when we chatted, I said, all right, let's look at the fixed costs. Like, what are the actual investment sort of capital outlays we're talking about? And if it doesn't work, can you hit undo? Like, what are the costs? Like, what's the carrying cost?
Sure.
And I'm making this up, right? These are not real numbers. But if we land at, well, worst case scenario, I think I'll be 50 to 75K in the red after all is said and done if I hit undo and have to sell everything after 3 years. I'm like, okay, well, would you pay $20,000 a year to know once and for all if this is something you enjoy doing? And then you're like, oh, okay, that's actually, from a life tuition perspective, something you can wrap your head around. And then you can think about opportunity cost or the cost of taking advantage of an experiment like this.
You think that life tuition experiments, that's how you think about it? Because I remember when you decided to be an angel investor, you looked at the cost of going to business school and you said, okay, it's $200,000. Why don't I just spend $200,000 investing in companies and I'll end up at the same place, which is I'll know how to invest in things. And with one, I'll have a degree and a piece of paper. And the other, I might have valuable stakes in a bunch of companies. Or if it fails in both cases, I'll have just $200,000 that I lit on fire, but I'll have learned something either way.
Yeah, I'll have learned something. I look at it, and this is not unique to me. This is something that Mark Andreessen has talked about. This is something, although he every once in a while just deletes everything he's ever written. So I'm not sure what the current status of that is. And Scott Adams has certainly spoken and written about this. He has an entire book, I think, dedicated to, effectively, I can't recall the title, but how to win even if you lose. How to fail bigly, perhaps. And the general heuristic is choosing projects based on the skills you will develop and the relationships you will develop, whether those are new or pre-existing, such that even if you don't get the outcome, public or private, that would be the objective marker of success. Let's say in the case of investing, making more than you put in. In the case of a bookstore, maybe you could say, all right, if you're trying to compare 100 bookstores, you would look at annual sales and this and that and revenue per employee, blah, blah, blah. Outside of that, though, what are some of the more abstract or less common line items that you could think about? Those could be skills. Those could be also skills that transfer, relationships that transfer to other areas, right? So if I look at my collaborations that I've done in various projects, like For Our Chef, which was, from an objective perspective, if we look at the bestseller lists, a failure compared to my other books.
Yes.
But it led directly to the podcast.
Yeah.
And for that reason, it has been my most profitable book by far. If we look at that as an antecedent to the podcast.
Right.
By far.
Yeah.
And you can't or at least I shouldn't evaluate the podcast in isolation, because the prerequisite was the set of experiences and the launch, which relied heavily on this new thing, relatively speaking, called podcasts.
Yes.
So that's how I think about it. And it takes a lot of also unnecessary stress or pressure out of the situation.
Mm-hmm. Well, it's funny though, because now the advice was very helpful and it feels like it worked out. But for the first year, it seemed like the worst idea in the entire world, because we were talking in maybe January of 2020. And so we got serious about it. Like we started the construction the first week of March 2020. So for the first year, it wasn't even a bookstore. It was just an enormous albatross around my neck, an empty building filled with books. Yeah. It was a series of bills that I was paying, but there was nothing coming back the other direction. But I remember I wrote this little note card to myself. Sort of speaking of stoicism, I said, "This is a test. Will it make you a better person or a worse person?" Right. And so the idea was, maybe this turns out to be an experiment that goes poorly from a business perspective, but how did I grow as a result of it? What did I learn, right? Did I learn to not do crazy things? Did I learn actually to do that I can do crazy things, that I can absorb failures, like
reframe crazy things by looking at them from a different perspective?
Yeah, right. What do you take from it so you can win either way?
Right. And the perspective shifting is really important. I mean, this is also, I'm looking at this bust right behind you, and
of Marcus, yes.
Yeah, reframing and thinking about labels very carefully, thinking about expectations very carefully, which tie into language, is super important. So in the case of, say, angel investing, almost anything you would ever read or hear about angel investing states something that is at face value very obvious, and that is high risk, super high risk. Even if you're successful, 80% of them, the investments will go to zero, yada, yada, yada. But the way that I folded the angel investing into a meta level plan to develop relationships and learn skills was not risky.
Yes.
At all.
You were going to get that whether the company was hugely successful or hugely unsuccessful. And in fact, you may get those things more on an investment that didn't work than one that did work.
Totally. And that certainly ended up being the case. Which is not to say they're called experiments, not guarantees, for a reason.
Yeah.
There are plenty that don't turn out the way that I would like them to turn out. But as long as I hold it lightly as an experiment and not Tim Ferriss's final exam for his self-worth, then you can roll with the punches, and it's not always easy.
Well, like when a scientist has an hypothesis and then they do an experiment and then the hypothesis turns out to be wrong, they're not like angry and they're like, "You're such an idiot. Why did you think that?" The whole point of the hypothesis was that it might be wrong. And the point of the experiment was to find out if it was right or wrong, not whether you're a genius or an idiot.
Yes, and there are human elements in science, of course, and people have confirmation bias, and there's a positive publication bias, and there are all of these things, and plenty of politics. Henry Kissinger, RIP, right, said he left academics because he couldn't take the politics at one point. So there was all of that, but the really good scientists, including, a lot of people have passed in the last year. Roland Griffiths, who I knew really well out of Hopkins, would say, that's a hypothesis worth disproving. I mean, that's the wording that you would sometimes hear.
Right. I like that.
So looking for disconfirming evidence.
Yeah. Right.
To counterbalance the very human inclination to look for what you want to see.
Well, you mentioned Mark Andreessen. Sometimes he tweets like, "huge if true." Like he'll take something and be like, "That's interesting if it's true." And the idea of like that. So that's another way of saying that's a hypothesis worth disproving or proving one way or the other.
Yeah, totally. I agree.
Yeah, it's your point though about like, okay, so you're going to do this thing. How do you mitigate or minimize risk, or just how do you define what those risks are? To me, that's the essence of stoicism. It's also what you've called fear setting, because sometimes like you think, okay, I want to do this thing, and then you're like, it could work, it could not work. It's high risk, it's a high risk thing potentially. But actually, it might be high risk of success or failure. But what is the actual downside? And sometimes something could be high risk, but the downside could be very low. right? So like oftentimes in our head, we exaggerate the downsides of things, right? Like I remember when I dropped out of college, obviously upside's high if it worked out. The downside I thought was I could end up living under a bridge somewhere, but actually the downside was, and I discovered this when I went to fill out the paperwork to drop
You end
out.
up owning a bookstore.
No, the
kidding.
downside was like, she was like, yeah, just come back. Like
Yeah,
you're just
exactly.
pausing your so in my head, I was making up that I was making this irrevocable life altering decision. And that's certainly what my parents thought. And that's certainly probably what most people think. But in fact, it was like a piece of administrative paperwork. And I found it the other day. It was $60. I have the receipt. It was $60 to effectively pause, my enrollment at college, of which I had 10 years to re-enroll.
Yeah, it's amazing.
And so what fear setting is, and I think with the Stoic, the Stoics call this the discipline of perception. It's this practice of going, yeah, I'm intimidated by it. I'm scared of it. I don't want to fail. But if I actually did fail, what's going to happen? And I think you very regularly find not much of anything that's going to happen. It's not as bad as you think it is.
And in a lot of cases, it's reversible. In the case of, the $60 prepayment for the optionality. And not to belabor the point, but the language you use matters a lot, right? So if you think about some of the commonly used language, right? This is a decision. Like there's a fork in the road and you have to choose a fork, implies that going backwards is going to be very difficult. Whereas a lot of these things, at least the way that I try to view them, and I don't do it perfectly, is more like walking into a closet and choosing which sweater you want to put on.
Yes.
You don't like it? Put it back on the rack.
Right.
Go back to the one you were wearing before. I mean, in a lot of cases, it's a much more it's a much more appropriate way to view things, and that is like a pause, or it's just really a temporary experiment that you can zig and zag with.
Yeah, the language, you're right, is very important, and it can cut both directions. So yeah, we say I'm dropping out of college versus I'm taking a semester off. Or yeah, we say I'm quitting my job, or one of the phrases you have in the 4-hour work week, a mini retirement. Like one feels empowering and the other feels dangerous or irresponsible. And so the language, so when I called you and I said, hey, I'm thinking about doing this bookstore, and you said, oh, that's a cool experiment. That was just a totally different phrase for what I was considering doing. All of the language I was using felt so permanent, so life-altering, so, enormous. And what you did with you shrunk it down to this small decision. Like you're saying, if someone going to their closet and they're picking out clothes, that's an ordinary metaphor versus, shoot for the moon or something like like are you thinking big? Are you thinking big or are you thinking small? And sometimes you want to think big, sometimes you want to think small, but just that the way you're looking at it, the words you're using determines like how large it's going to loom
Totally
over you.
And also, I recently reread, and it's a little schlocky because it was written a long time ago, but I still find it helpful. There's a book by Dale Carnegie, who a lot of people know for How to Win Friends and Influence People, I believe it was. And he has a lesser known book that has still sold millions of copies called How to Stop Worrying and Start Living, which includes a lot of stoic-ish tenets. And it's a very fun read because there are many, many different case studies and historical references. A lot of them are out of date. When he talks about neuroscience, don't pay a lot of attention. However, the general principles and examples are really helpful. And he talks a lot about incomplete information, and improving your sort of visibility into a given situation by adding more information, and that it is somewhat pointless if you can easily add that information to worry about it beforehand.
Yeah.
And the reason I bring that up is that in a case like opening a bookstore, right? Open a bookstore is this big kind of macro abstracted decision. In reality, it's a whole lot of different decisions.
Little ones.
Yes. Such as looking into the actual costs.
Yeah.
Looking at what's available. Looking at the current, let's just call it borrowing rates, et cetera. And so you could say, yes, I'm going to pursue this experiment, but only the next X steps. Like I'm not committing to 3 years,
Yeah.
but I am committing to gathering more information so I can determine if I want to take the sort of
Yeah.
10 steps after those preliminary steps. So I'll do that a lot as well, where it's like, okay, do I want to write a next book? Well, how would I decide what types of mini decisions could I make? What types of information could I gather that would help me to have a higher degree of conviction around whether I want to do it or not? Okay, let's take a week and do that first. Look at the landscape, talk to agent or agents, talk to authors, look at A, B, C, D, and E. I mean, of course, look at subject matter and so on. And then you have much better footing for considering if you want to keep pushing forward. But breaking these big, heavy sounding macro decisions into smaller steps also, I think, highlights the fact that it's not, you're not firing a gun, right? Like if you get to C and then you want to stop and not continue to D, you very often have the ability to do that.
Yeah. It's, I remember when I was talking to you about starting a podcast, you gave me advice similarly. You were like, don't do a podcast, do 6 episodes of a podcast, right? And if you think about it, it's like, don't open a restaurant, open a pop-up, right? Like, so of course there's a reason that the economic incentives and life wants you to make big permanent commitments. It's usually cheaper. Like, you know what I mean? Like to go, they want to lock you in for a long period of time. They want you to be more invested. And you have to understand that what you're purchasing is a certain amount of optionality by not fully committing. And so, so going, hey, I'm going to do 6 episodes, that can feel harder in some ways, but it's easier in that it allows you to just do the thing, not overthink it, get started on it. And then hopefully the feedback either gives you momentum in one direction or the other about what you should or shouldn't do.
What it also does is it gives you a graceful exit. So when people ask me about podcasts, this is true for a lot of things. I'm like, limited time only. That is the key phrasing or at least concept that you put forth so that you don't succumb to the very kind of chimpanzee politics inclinations that we all have. I'm going to be embarrassed. It's going to look like a failure. I can't stop because of the following types of perceptions. But if you just say up front, I'm doing a single season of a podcast, 6 episodes, 10 episodes. If it goes well and you extend it, everybody's happy, versus saying, I'm going to have a podcast implying indefinite and then stopping after 6 or 10 episodes. Psychologically, it's much more difficult for the person in the driver's seat, in this case you or me, to make that exit. And so to preserve the flexibility, I do that all the time. And the optionality is important. Now, infinite optionality is a problem.
Yeah,
right?
sure.
Then you have decision fatigue and so on. But I can make nominal sacrifices financially in some areas that free up a bunch of energy and resources that I can allocate somewhere where it matters a lot more.
So you said something to me one time in regards to that. You said something like, what do you do with your money? Right. And I was like, what do you mean? You're like, do you like buy speedboats or like, you know, you're like, what are your like expensive hobbies? Right. And I was like, I don't really have any. And then you're like, okay, so make your career and business decisions accordingly. Right.
That might have been related to the bookstore.
No, this is well before. I remember
before
I was walking around in New York City. I just started my first company. Your point was if you don't need lots of money, don't optimize your life around earning lots of money, right? I guess what you're saying is like, if you don't need it, why are you trading? This is a very Stoic idea. Why are you trading your most precious resource, which is your life, or in my case, my creative energy? Why are you trading that to get a thing that you don't necessarily need, right? You weren't saying like money is not important. You were just saying if money's not your number one priority, make sure that you're not doing things for which the statement is money is my most important priority.
Yeah, right. Look at your calendar. Right?
Yeah. Yeah.
Don't tell me what's important. Like, let's take a look at your calendar. I'll tell you what's important to you.
Well, I think what I like about this is, okay, so oftentimes when people think about Stoicism, they think about it as a philosophy that is resilient. It's about dealing with adversity. It's about dealing with difficulty. And it's true. I mean, Epictetus is a slave, right? Marcus Aurelius lives in a plague. The Stoics lived hard lives. But it's also a philosophy for success. I don't mean it's a philosophy that will make you successful. The idea is the Stoics are saying that everything is an opportunity to practice the Stoic virtues. And by that, they meant you get your arm cut off, a pandemic happens, you get thrown in prison on unjust charges. These are opportunities to practice Stoicism. But it's also a chance to practice Stoicism when you find yourself the emperor. It's a chance to practice Stoicism if the company that you invested in becomes worth billions of dollars, right? Mm-hmm. Or if you become successful as an author or as whatever you do. Like, I think less explored because it's slightly less relatable. Most people are dealing with hard things. Stoicism is also a philosophy designed to help you with abundance or success in life. Would you agree?
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah.
How has Stoicism helped you you've done very well. You've done lots of interesting things. You've been at the top of the author game, the podcast game. You've been a great investor. How do you think of Stoicism in that sense as something that helps you deal with what we would call champagne problems or too much of a good thing? Stoicism is also there.
You can see the YouTube thumbnail now. Tim Ferriss on champagne problems. There are a few things that immediately come to mind. So the first is I do a lot of things that I know are perceived by many people to be high risk that I don't consider high risk at all because I've run through exercises and journaling and so on that lean very heavily on Stoic practices and have come to the definitive conclusion that this is not holistically high risk.
I see.
When I did angel investing from, say, 2008 to 2015, it got crowded. I felt like it went from single deck blackjack where you could kind of count the cards to 5 deck, and then the table stakes got a lot higher.
Yeah.
So I stopped for a while. And I've done that over and over again, right? Stopped the books for a while. And in this particular case, I'm like, all right, I may not find an answer, but it would be a mistake not to look for an answer. Like, what's neglected? And that's not necessarily something new. For instance, I think text is neglected.
Yes.
I think writing is neglected.
Yes.
And text isn't dead. It's just not surfaced by the algorithms. It's just not favored at the moment. But
it's the most perennial of the mediums.
It's the most perennial and it's the hardest. So if I'm looking at differentiation and competitive advantage, you have this too, right?
Yeah.
You can write. Writing's hard.
Yeah.
Writing is very, very hard, at least for me. And for that reason, I'm like, all right, well, maybe it's just the return to basics in that sense. Maybe it's fitting something old into a new vehicle, et cetera, et cetera. Let's come up with a lot of bad ideas to see if there's maybe one or two good ideas we can test. And so to come back to your question, though, I think that is a way of avoiding comparison with others that can lead directly to outperformance if we're talking about success in financial terms. But it's also very compatible with success on your own terms.
Mm-hmm.
And reflecting on applications of Stoic-like thinking, right? And let's expand. All right, what other ways could this type of thinking apply? And I think that extends to 80-20 principle, Richard Koch type stuff. I think it extends to, it's really about the number of people who get it, not the number of people who don't get it. So Kevin Kelly, 1,000 True Fans type of thinking, blue ocean versus red ocean, blue ocean strategy kind of stuff. These are all highly, highly compatible. And I would go further to say there are a lot of people who, at this point, they've probably heard the word Stoic, at least in the modern sense, lowercase, but they're not familiar with the canon of Stoicism. Yet, if you look at anyone who has thrived in what most people consider high stress environments, they're going to walk the walk. I think that there's such a selection bias. There's a survival bias towards anyone who indirectly or directly has put into practice these principles on a regular basis, that if you look at, and this is just, these are hypotheticals. I haven't asked these people, but like anyone from a Bob Iger to a hedge fund manager to an exceptionally good athlete who has had longevity, if you were to sit them down and walk them through Marcus Aurelius and so on for the first time, they'd be like, oh yeah. No, that's how I live my life.
Yes. Yeah, you have to, because look, the chief task in life, the Stoics would say, is like finding what's in your control and what's not in your control. Mm-hmm. Now, this is going to shift depending on who you are and where you are in the world, right? Like Epictetus his understanding of what was in his control and what's not in control. It's going to be fundamentally different than Marcus Aurelius. They're living a generation apart. One's a slave. One's the most powerful man in the world. One has slightly more things that are in his control than the other. So yeah, it changes a little bit, but more things remain outside your control than in your control. And that fundamentally dealing with stress, high performance, success, whatever you're dealing with, is coming down to this really basic, almost so basic it doesn't feel like it could be ancient philosophy, but is like, hey, what part of this can I influence, and what part of this do I have to accept and just deal with and find a way to adapt and get comfortable with?
From my perspective, Stoicism is good for survival and self-preservation for the same reason it's good for success.
Yeah.
However you might define that. But let's just say being an outlier in some type of performance. It is because Stoicism helps you to conserve and best deploy your limited resources.
Yeah.
So for instance, if you are, and humans are humans, right?
Yeah.
So you're going to slip, you're going to make mistakes. At least certainly I do. So it's a lot of this is work in progress, but if you are easily offended, you're a poor resource allocator.
Yeah.
And if you look at the most successful CEOs of all time in a book, interestingly enough, called The Outliers is one example. Like, one of the key characteristics is they're very good capital allocators, but what that comes down to is limited resource allocators.
Yeah.
So time, energy, attention, capital in this case. I think that the tenets of Stoicism help you to be a better resource allocator, coming back to what you said, by pausing a lot to say or think about what is in your control and what is out of your control. If it's out of your control, trying to allocate as few calories, as few minutes, as few dollars to that as humanly possible.
Yeah.
And sometimes it's tricky. Sometimes it's hard. Sometimes there are gray areas. And so you have to make your best, fast decision with the information that you have. But I think that the tools are the same. The tools are the same. And there are plenty of things I've folded into my own life that are, I think, highly compatible with Stoicism that you might not find in the pages of some of the classics. But it's a mistake to think about Stoicism as a joyless toolkit for preventing pain and ensuring survival. There's a lot more to it.
Of course.
Like, it's a more flexible toolkit.
Yeah. My wife's been saying that, like, the key skill in life, as we're thinking about this with young kids, like she says the key skill in life is the ability to deal with frustration.
Yeah.
Right. Or that basically at the end of the day, it comes down to, can you regulate your emotions? Mm-hmm. And so whether you're dealing with a catastrophe or what Tennessee Williams calls the catastrophe of success, right, which is its own catastrophe, like, it basically comes down to emotional regulation. Can you regulate extreme elation? Can you regulate extreme despair? And can you figure out how not to be overwhelmed by the situation you're in, but figure out, okay, what am I going to do about it? What am I being asked to do here? What's the best thing to do here? What's going to get me in more trouble? What's going to give you less? You know, you're trying to figure out how do you integrate, address, respond, not be corrupted by, you know, whatever the moment that you're in. And that's the same at either end of the extremes.
And you can really extend the scope of regulation. At least I do, to think about a lot of different factors, and also a compatible and, I think, complementary word, which is repair. Right. So I have a very hypervigilant system. Right. From, we don't have to spend time on it, but I had some awful things happen to me as a kid, and my sympathetic nervous system goes into overdrive very easily. Yeah. And I have tried 1,000,001 tools for preventing this from happening. But the reality is that there are many instances in any given week. This week is actually a very good example. Actually texted a friend, can I curse on this podcast? Yeah. Where I was like, because he knows what's going on. Yeah. And I was like, so I put in quotation marks. I was like, surprise, bitch. It's time for your surprise semester exam from the universe. Yeah. And I was like, okay, sure. You're doing all this meditation, reading all this Stoicism. Yeah. Let's see what you got. Yeah. And this week was one of those weeks. And there have been times when I'm like, my God, like my resting heart rate is at like 120.
Yeah.
And then it's about repair. And the tools are the same. The tools are very similar, right? Thinking about like sitting down, doing a little serenity prayer, and also thinking about the worst case scenario, testing assumptions, and the repair is incredibly important. And also thinking about not just what thoughts are you going to have, what questions are you going to ask, what exercises are you going to do in your head that will help in these moments, whether it's preventative or repair, but also thinking about the conditions that lend themselves to dysregulation. Too much caffeine, too little sleep, alcohol before bed. And a lot of the times, like, you don't need to sit down. You're having a really rough day and you're like, wow, I need to figure out my life. Fuck, what am I going to do when I grow up? I'm lost. And it's like, no, you have low blood sugar and you didn't sleep. Like, you need some macadamia nuts and a cold shower and a nap.
And don't you think repair, one, taking care of yourself, so self-care, working through it, but this is something I definitely think the Stoics didn't talk about enough. And so I don't think the Stoics are flawless or perfect in any way. But it's also repair to the person you yelled at because you got upset.
100%.
Or the person you were frustrated with because you were anxious, or, you know, or the person you neglected because you were consumed by this thing, right? Mm-hmm. Like, Stoicism isn't never freaking out, never going into a downward spiral, never being overwhelmed by your emotions. It's hopefully catching yourself before you've done something terrible as a result of those things. And hopefully, as you get better, ratcheting sooner and sooner how fast you can do it. But it's what you do after you've done it, right? After you have the awareness to go, okay, I didn't live up to my standards here. I did something I shouldn't have done. I understand and empathize with the consequences that had on you. And I'm sorry, right? Like that Stoicism isn't just being this invulnerable, disconnected
hermit,
autonomous being, but you exist in society and you exist in relationships.
Yeah.
And that the repair isn't just to yourself, but to those people too.
Very much along the lines of some of the chapters in 4,000 Weeks by Oliver Burkeman, which I think is a great book.
Yeah.
I really enjoyed this book. And there is a chapter, I think it's called Cosmic Insignificance Therapy, but really zooming out and looking at your goals, problems, hangups, neuroses in a broader and broader context of the world and history and the universe. And this sounds very hand-wavy, but it ends up being very, very therapeutic. And the reason I bring that up is that it's another way to take the magnifying glass off of some of your issues.
Yeah.
Right? Like, reflect on the problems. Like, this week, 5 years ago, what were you worried about? Can't remember? Yeah, exactly.
Right. Well, I was just thinking about this because two different times in meditations, Mark Strauss talks about taking the view from above. He calls it Plato's view.
The belief that, and I'm borrowing here, this is definitely attributed to somebody else, but never let a good crisis go to waste.
Yes.
And really deeply believing, and this could be self-deception, but it's enabling self-deception. It's to look at that problem and to really sit down and ideally write out how the problem is based on your assumptions that you have about how things should work or how you should do things. And I think it's Dan Sullivan, who I've never had any direct interactions with, but he runs something called, I think it's the Strategic Coach. And he talks about how the problem isn't the problem, it's how you view the problem. Yeah. That is the problem. And I've been trying
it's not things that upset us, it's our opinion about things, the Stoics say.
Yeah, exactly. And to figure out, like, why is this a problem?
Yeah.
Is it because your 5 friends handle this problem in this way and they have established this as a priority because it is a problem for them? Is it something you should be doing in the first place?
Yeah.
Is there a way to remove this entire category of problem by stopping something, by hiring someone, by firing someone, et cetera?
Yeah.
And I'm doing a lot of that right now. It's a good time for us to have this conversation because it's a good reminder for me on a lot of levels. And I'm having to pull out all the tools in the toolkit.
I gave a talk to Live Nation last week. And so I was like trying to think, like, what's like a music story I could tell? And so I told the story of Taylor Swift. So like in 2019, Taylor Swift's masters are sold from her first 5 albums. They're actually bought by Scooter Braun, she's very upset by this. Scooter Braun reads the Daily Stoic, so I make no judgment. He's cool with me. But her masters are sold, right?
Yeah.
And she decides that this is a problem. She's very upset by it, right? And can't argue with the fact that she doesn't like it, right? Like you could say this is just a part of how the music business works, and that he didn't do anything wrong, but she didn't like it, right? To her, it represented this kind of betrayal, and she was really pissed off that now somebody else controls the masters to her music. So funny enough, she sees this tweet. Kelly Clarkson tweets about it, like two musicians helping each other, I guess. And she goes, "Why don't you just re-record all your masters and put out new art?" Right? Which seems like a crazy idea. Like, why would anyone do that? But that's what she did. She spent the whole pandemic re-recording every song plus a bunch of bonus songs and shooting new art for her first 5 albums, right? So when people think like Taylor Swift is now unequivocally the biggest artist in the world, maybe the biggest person
Also
in the world.
raises so many questions for me about how you can even legally do that also.
Well,
I know copyright is the expression.
Yes.
But
there's two kinds of intellectual property in music, which is interesting, which I don't fully understand either. But the point is, when people see like the Eras tour, like, which is not just the most successful concert tour in history, it's earned more than the second and third 2 tours have combined. Like even the movie about the tour has made over $100 million, right? So it's the biggest thing in the history of music, probably the history of the entertainment business, of a singular artist doing a singular thing. It's actually a result. You want to talk about the obstacles of the way? It's a result of this seemingly terrible thing happening to her, right? So the thing happens to her, her masters are sold, but how she responds to it, her decision not to waste it and to use it, to channel that energy into some productive end is what creates what's possible now, right? Because it seems like she's always been this big, and she has always been big, but the process of re-releasing 5 consecutive albums plus 2 that she recorded, 2 or 3 that she recorded just of all new music during the pandemic, makes her like this powerhouse in music because it's like every day there's a new song. Yeah. Every month there's something new from her. So she's just been the recipient of just endless amounts of media attention. She's been rediscovered by a whole generation of people, right? And then it sets up going on this tour where she says, I'm going to play music from every era of my life, right? Mm-hmm. And so I think it's such an interesting example. Like when we say never let a crisis go to waste, crisis isn't, your whole family is murdered in front of you, right? Crisis is also just like something that you didn't want to happen happens to you. And then you are defined by what you do in response to that. And it can be a springboard for things that not only you didn't think were possible, but like nobody thought were possible. Mm-hmm. For artists typically re-record their music, and it's just this like kind of technical legal thing that manifests itself in the fan experience in basically no noticeable way. But the way she did it and the way she set it up set about this transformational, transcendent series of events that have made her what she is. And that all comes from this thing that if you had asked her in that moment, do you want this to happen to you? Mm-hmm. She would have said, not on my fucking life. Yeah, totally. I would rather die than that happen. Yeah. And that's what we have the ability to do. And so I think when we think of Stoicism as this philosophy of resilience and creativity and it's she's a very privileged person when this happens to her. She's already extremely successful. It's not just for you at your lowest moment, but you can transform things that happen to you into that if you want.
Yeah, I mean on a much smaller scale.
Yeah.
I mean what
everything is on a smaller
what wouldn't
scale.
Be on a smaller scale. 4 Hour Chef, right?
Yeah.
That was a book that completely burned me out. Yeah. I mean, I burned myself out.
Sure.
It was probably a 3-year, very complex book, very, very detailed, very involved. My first 4-color book. I decided it would be a great idea if I did like 40% of the photography myself, even though I'm not a photographer. Great idea.
Also, just you wanted to learn a thing you didn't know how to do. That
right.
was like
right.
Also just the content of the book itself, like the ideas was not easy.
Yeah, so this was an incredibly difficult book. I'm very proud of how it was executed, but crammed something that should have been 3 or 4 years into a year and a half, and just flamed out.
Yeah.
And at the time, again, I would have said I absolutely would never have wanted this outcome.
Yeah.
But when you have an experience like that, or when Taylor has an experience like that, I can't speak for her, but I imagine.
Yeah.
what an experience like that does is it gives you permission to take time to step back
Yeah.
and to pause and to look at things with fresh eyes in a way that you often disallow yourself from doing if you are chugging along, keeping the trains running on time,
Yeah.
following your daily, weekly routine, whatever that might be. And it doesn't always work out, but in my case, without that window, also without that extreme fatigue, I do not think I would have possibly experimented with the podcast.
I was just writing about this kind of pine tree, and I'm forgetting what it's called exactly, but I have one of the pine cones in my office as a reminder. But basically, so it's like any other pine tree, drops a pine cone has the seeds in it, right? That's how the new trees come. But these pine cones, like, if you ever see a pine cone that hasn't like done that yet, it's still like the green. It only unlocks when it is subjected to temperatures that weather alone cannot reach. So it's only forest fires that allow it to do what it does. So the thing that is the worst thing in the world for the tree, which is a fire, which burns down the forest, is also what allows a new stand of trees to come in its place, right? And so like, it's funny, I was looking at the tree, I was like, this doesn't look burned. Like, how did she get it to open? I bought it on Etsy. Well, she puts them in a tray and then she puts it in the oven. Like she gets them, she puts it in the, but the point is, it only does what it does when subjected to extreme, you might even say unnatural amounts of stress or adversity. And there is something, to me, that's the essence of what Stoic philosophy is. Like Marcus Aurelius is a student of philosophy, then he becomes emperor. And then basically everything that can go wrong goes wrong for the next 20 consecutive years, right? There's the Antonine Plague, there's floods, there's a coup attempt, there's war, right? He buries multiple children, right? Like it's like everything that can go wrong goes wrong. But that's when he becomes Marcus Aurelius. Like he would have been his predecessor, Antoninus, his model in all things. Basically, nobody knows his name and nobody thinks about him at all because he got 20 years of peace and prosperity. Like everything that could go right goes right for him and he's basically forgettable. Everything goes wrong for Marcus and he becomes the person that you read about in the pages of Meditations, right? And so it's this idea, I think, that you want things to go the way you think you want them to go. And then it's only when they don't go that way that you figure out what you're really capable of and you do the things that really you're only capable of in those moments.
It makes me think, I haven't thought about this in a long time, but it was either Ann Murico, who's a very well-known investor, tech investor, or Mike Maples also. They work together, investor. I think it was one of the two, but apologies if I'm misattributing, guys,
Sure.
Which is something along the lines of sometimes you need life to save you from what you think you want.
Yeah, exactly.
And that has been, I think, a real key for me. Are those mints or
Hey,
nicotine?
you want a caffeine mint?
Oh, caffeine mint? No, I'm good.
Not a sponsor, by the way. I'm just addicted. Yeah, you think you want it to go a certain way, and of course it doesn't. I was just reading this story about Hemingway. So Hemingway is this aspiring novelist. He's living with his wife in France. He's in Switzerland and he's meeting with this famous journalist, and his wife, he like telegrams her to come meet him. He wants to introduce her to her, but she's like, oh, he wants me to bring all his work to show off to this guy. So she gets everything he's ever written in his life.
God.
She gathers
I see where this is going.
She gathers it all up, puts it in a briefcase, gets on a train, heads towards Switzerland. She's in a train station in like Lyons or something. And she gets off to get like a coffee. She comes back to the train car. The briefcase is gone.
Oh, God.
Was it stolen? Did she lose it? Did she set it? We don't know, but it's gone. Everything he has ever written disappears. And Hemingway is, of course, devastated and feels like his whole life is ruined. I don't know how a marriage would possibly recover from this. It does not, right? But he writes this letter a few weeks later to Ezra Pound, and he goes, I know what you're going to tell me. He's like, you're going to tell me good, start over. But he's like, I'm not there yet, you know? And I love that too, because it's easy to be flippant about this. Like Taylor Swift did not, the next day after her master's sell, go, I'm going to re-record all my albums and it's going to transform me into the stratosphere, right? Like, it's okay to feel sorry for yourself for a while. It's okay to fucking be pissed too. And I don't think you think about all the things Marcus Aurelius goes through. There's got to be days he does not get out of bed, right? He must have been devastated and pissed off. But it's after you accept it and then you get to work on it that you can turn it into that thing. And what happens is basically like a forest fire, all the underbrush for Hemingway is cleared out and he has to start over. And he invents his new sort of writing style as a result of basically in his mid-20s losing everything, right? And so it's in retrospect, we know this is what happens. Like when you look at any phase in your life where the worst thing that could happen to you happened to you, now you have integrated it in and you see how it helped you get where you're going.
Yeah, by the way, with the podcast, like it wasn't obvious on day one. It wasn't even obvious on the anniversary of year one, probably not even year two.
Yeah.
Right. It was not clear. And I also want to state for the record that not all crises turn into these Willy Wonka golden tickets, right?
Yes.
A lot of them are just things that you need to weather.
Yes.
But I've tried to cultivate the habit of at least looking for the possibility that there is an angle from which I can see something that I would miss if I were just singing the Woe Is Me song.
Well, it's like sometimes the disaster or the crisis presents an opportunity to advance professionally or, from a profit perspective. Like sometimes, hey, this thing closes this door and it opens this crazy window that you never would have gone through. And that turns out to be the best thing that happens to you. I think it's important, like when we say the obstacles away, obviously I wrote a book on this, but like, I'm not saying that everything is that. Right? Because how does a cancer diagnosis become that? Or like the death of your father become that? Or a pandemic where millions of people die? Like shit happens that's just fucking terrible, right? That's life. And it's important that we're not dismissive of the profound pain and anguish that's a result of that. The Stoics would still say the opportunity, and I don't think they would use the word opportunity because it feels, again, insensitive, but they would say that's still demands of you certain character traits. It's still an opportunity for what they would call arete or excellence. Like you still have to be a person inside that, and you have to weather it, endure it, be of service to your fellow human beings. You know what I mean? So it's not always like a chance to just like make more money or, build your brand. Like it's not always great for your career, but it can always be. That's why I wrote during the pandemic, I wrote that note. I didn't say like, this is the chance for you to like make a killing in real estate, or like this is a chance for you to really take a lock on the independent bookstore market. Like I was looking out over this bookstore that was looking like it was going to be the biggest failure of my life, and go, it can make me a better person or a worse one, right? Like it can also cost me my marriage. It could also cost me my creative energy. I could make it worse if I wanted to. I could also be improved by it, right? I could become more aware of my capacities. I could learn from the mistakes. My relationship could get better. My connection to human beings could get better. I could realize, hey, in the big scheme of things, none of this shit matters. There's so many things you could take from it to emerge as a better person, almost all of which are not related to money or success in really any way. But okay, so I wouldn't even fault the audience for this necessarily. I would fault myself. My initial read on, like, we see what we want to see when we're looking for stuff, right? Or we see what we need to see at that point in our life. And so my early takes on Stoicism, I would say were primarily about what it could give me, right? How it can make me more resilient, how it can make me stronger, how it can make me smarter, how it can make me more successful. Like I was looking at Stoicism through what it's been for lots of people for thousands of years, which is a form of self-help, right? And of course I understood that he's talking about virtue, he's talking about common good and all these things. But I would say it wasn't until later that I understood. So the cardinal virtues of Stoicism are courage, self-discipline, justice, and wisdom. But if you really think about it, the key virtue is justice, because it decides whether any of the other ones were worthwhile or not, right? So like courage
I can't wait to hear this.
Courage in pursuit of the wrong thing or a cruel and selfish or whatever thing, right? Courage in pursuit, like courage or discipline, or was it like, if it's not rooted towards like making the world better or doing what the Stoics would call the right thing, right? Their understanding of justice isn't like the legal system. It's like, what kind of person are you and what kind of code or values do you have? I think I came later than I came later to a more full understanding of what Stoicism is asking of you, as opposed to what it can provide you. Does that make sense?
Yeah.
And I'm just finishing this book now on justice, which will be the third book in that series. So I've been thinking a lot about it more. But like almost all the Stoics were active in politics. Almost all the Stoics wrote books to share what they learned. Like there was this sense, the fundamental difference between the Epicureans and the Stoics, Seneca says, is that an Epicurean basically withdraws from the stresses and complications of life into the garden where they have fun and enjoy themselves and hang out with their friends. And a Stoic is involved in the polis, like in public life. And so I feel like my writing has changed and evolved, and my focus on that thing has changed and evolved more. So I can sometimes tell when a fan is upset with me because they're at an earlier place in the understanding of Stoicism, which I once was, and they're hearing from me now and they don't get, you know what I mean? Like they
it's
want
hard for them to sort of reconcile the two, or maybe just to take on both at the same time.
It's like, they're like, I wanted you to give me advice on how I could be a better sociopath. You know what I mean? And you're telling me that I'm not supposed to be a sociopath, right? And that's the big one to me.
I wrote this piece called something like The Karmic Capitalist, or Principles of Karmic Capitalism, where I laid out some of my early thinking on this. So I took a long hiatus from that type of thinking and have come back to it. But it is a practice. It is a practice. And I found your comment on justice as sort of this isn't going to be the best phrasing, but the sort of master determinant of virtue or lack of virtue when you're right, the sort of parent virtue above others, in a sense. I've been thinking quite a lot about mother qualities, right? So for instance, like what is the rate limiter, which is slightly different than what you were saying. But if you talk to like Pavel Tsatsouline about physical fitness, so he popularized kettlebells in the United States and really knows his stuff. And for him, it's like strength first. Like strength, if you look at longevity, if you look at health span, if you look at your ability to execute other things, he's like, before you worry about flexibility, before you worry about mobility, before you worry about endurance, strong first. That's the name of his company, in fact. And I was like, okay, that's very, even if it's inaccurate, I happen to think it's accurate. It's helpful to sit and think about that for a second and interrogate that concept. And so to give you a window in, right, I do Five Bullet Friday, this newsletter every Friday, goes out to a couple million people. And I capture things as I'm out in the world that are going to later make it into Five Bullet Friday. So as we're recording this, something that I'm working on are a few quotes that are compatible, that all touch on the same thing, which is laying out a hierarchy of virtues. And they word it very eloquently. Maya Angelou is one. And she talks about courage as the mother virtue, because all other virtues at their testing point. Right?
Yeah, and that quote, that it's all, I think there's a C.S. Lewis version of that same quote.
There are a bunch.
And it's true. And I think I said this in the book I did on courage, that courage is the essential virtue because you can't do any of the other things without courage. And it's true. It's just, the absence of justice or the absence of it being the right thing immediately renders whatever it is worthless. If you win the Medal of Honor for the Confederacy, you know, it's like there's something hollow about. Like there's a Lord Byron quote where he says, "'Tis the cause makes all that hallows or degrades courage in its fall." like what it is in pursuit of. Like there's so many lonely stands you could take.
Those
right?
old timers love their rhymes. You got to start rhyming more.
Well, that's a poem. So, but that was from a poem. But the point is, like, there's a lot of lonely stands
Doesn't
you could
mean
take.
you can't do some stoic spoken word stuff. Anyway,
If you're taking the lonely stand, but it's wrong, you know what I mean?
Yeah,
Or it's like it's rendered worthless.
both of these are interesting. I mean, I'm glad that you brought up Justice Peace because now I can think about both of these side by side.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah.
And if you have a common failure mode, right? It's like if something dysregulates you, if there are certain issues that seem to repeat, if you have certain patterns with your significant other, it's like, okay,
Right.
is this, and because justice can also be hijacked by the righteous mind.
Of course.
You know what I mean?
Yeah. Yeah.
Right.
Yeah.
But it helps to have a list, like a checklist to run through. Anyway, just wanted to say I'm really glad you brought it up because now I have a completely different lens on a list that I might have automatically ordered with courage at the top,
Interesting.
in a sense.
I'll send you the book. I just sent it into the publisher like 3 days ago. But
You know what? I'm gonna let people in on some inside baseball. So part of the reason it's done.
yeah,
It's done. It's finished.
it's finished.
100%.
100% done.
Okay. All right. Then maybe I can take a look at it because and we've had this experience before.
You sent me finished books with pages ripped out. You're like, delete this page, delete this page.
Yeah. If I get sent a manuscript, part of the reason that I'm just like, I don't read manuscripts is because I cannot turn off editing. And so I will do a full book edit that takes an absurd shit ton of time because I can't turn it off. And I'm not going to be an editor, but I think I'm a better editor than a writer.
There's lower stakes when you're
lower
editing someone
stakes,
else's
right?
stuff.
I'm just like, yeah, we should definitely take out the appendix. Yeah, no, you don't really need your left toe. We can take that off because I don't have to actually deal with the consequences. But that level of detachment, which I have with very few things, it's helpful, right? Like when I'm looking for editors, I try to embolden them to be willing to say, yeah, we should lose your left toe.
Yeah, well, whenever you've sent me your stuff, you always say something like, what's your least favorite chapter? What chapter would you cut? Right? Where's it too long?
If you had to cut a chapter.
You're never like, what do you like? You know?
No, I'm like, if you had to cut 20%, what would you cut?
So to go back to generosity, the other thing I think I would point out, because again, it can feel very sort of first worldly where it's like we associate generosity and money. But of course, there's many ways to be generous, right? Like, can you be just like, I think we talked about competition earlier. It's so easy to live in a world where you think things are zero sum, right? And that if somebody else gets ahead, it means it's coming at your expense in some way. And I think even there, I've had to grow, and I feel like I've changed, which is like, I now feel in some ways more excited when I help someone else succeed, or if I open a door for someone than I do with my own stuff, right? Like, and the idea of just that's a result of having helped people and experienced how wonderful that felt, right? Do you know what I mean? Before you do it, it feels like stupid.
We can also paint it in a very maybe helpful, self-serving way, which is, let's put generosity aside for a second, although it is one way to describe some of these behaviors.
Yeah.
If you, for instance, well, let me just put out an observation first, which is I think that generosity is inversely correlated to wealth in the first world as a percentage of what you possess. I actually believe that from what I've seen, like the more money people have, the better they are at the money accumulating game, the less they want to part with it.
Sure.
And
that's probably how they accumulated in the first place.
right.
Yeah.
And I think, look, I'm sure I'm guilty of that on some level.
Yeah.
Right. Like you have to value money to accumulate a bunch of it, unless you're just, okay, fine. Like you got drunk and bought the Powerball and there you go. You have a few $100 million.
Sure.
That doesn't usually last very long.
Right.
If that's the case. But I'll put it this way. If you, and this is something we've been talking about a little bit earlier directly, but mostly indirectly, and that is if you go into Starbucks tomorrow and you're paying for your coffee and you give the barista $20 and you're like, I'm paying for the person or two behind me.
Yeah.
That act implicitly says, I have more than enough.
Yeah.
That is a very uncommon perception of reality in, say, the United States.
Yeah.
In a go, go, go,
Sure.
accumulate capitalist society.
Yeah.
It is just, I think, very uncommon. Like, I have more than enough.
Yeah.
That is
sure.
what that act says.
I have extra.
I have extra. Not only do I have what I need, I have extra, is what that says.
Yeah.
Can you afford? Forget about $20. Can you give like $5?
Yeah.
And say, like, hey, whoever comes in under $5.
Yeah.
If you can afford to go to Starbucks to buy your venti frappuccino with God knows what diabetes fuel in it, then
your breakfast milkshake.
Yeah, if your breakfast milkshake, you can probably afford to pay for someone's like next small black coffee. And that is a non-trivial act.
Yeah.
As a sort of statement of self-appraisal.
Yeah.
It sounds silly, but it's
But
like,
you're
try it.
reinforcing it. Actually, the beneficiary of that is you.
Yeah, yeah.
Because
Try
you
it.
are
Like, try it tomorrow.
You are not just saying that you have enough. You are acting as if you have enough. Like, as they say, act as if. You are acting as if you have enough.
Yeah.
And then it becomes truer to you at a more like cellular level.
Mm-hmm.
And then so when you hear about some natural disaster or somebody, your employee asks for your raise or something, you can go like, I don't need to approach this from a scarcity mindset, which is the default setting. I think of the human species. I mean, we come from a place where there was never enough food, right? Survival was, we were always teetering on the edge of survival. And then depending on where you come, like more recently, your grandparents grew up in the Depression or you grew up as an immigrant in a poor country, like depending on what that is, it's even compounding just the biological urge of like, never enough, save some, store, winter is coming, right? So you're practicing and teaching yourself, you're developing the virtue, as Aristotle says, by doing the thing.
Yeah, and practicing gripping it lightly, right? And by the way, that small act of paying for somebody behind you, as an easy example, like that transcends money.
Yeah.
Right? Which is why I think, I tend to do better in crisis than I do with like the small paper cuts in life.
Yeah, me too.
So my work to do is with the little annoyances, very often human factors.
Yeah.
This is where justice gets me in trouble. It's just the principle of the thing. Oh boy, now Tim's about to really punish himself. But to the extent that I've made progress on the crisis side and to the extent that I've made progress on the paper cut side, I think it's through these little things. Yeah. And those things compound and they become a habit.
Well, it's important,
And it's a habit of thinking, by the way.
Yes.
It's the habit of action leads to a habit of thinking.
And vice versa.
And vice versa. You can probably give me the attribution. You're so much better at this than I am. But it's easier to act your way into a new way of thinking than to think your way into a new way of acting. This would be an example, I think, potentially of that. They're not mutually exclusive, but that would be an example.
It's funny, right? The obstacle is the way, which is from this quote from Marcus Aurelius. He does talk a lot in Meditations about how like difficult circumstances, obstacles are fuel, whatever. But specifically that quote, I truncated, like I shortened it. I didn't include some of the beginning and I cut out some of the middle. But that fuller quote is about annoying, obnoxious people. He says it's about the people who obstruct us, right? Mm-hmm. And I mean, he opens Meditations with, he was clearly perpetually annoyed with human beings. And he would have had to interact with lots of them, probably many of the worst of them, right, as his job.
What was his line? It was like, when you leave the house today, expect that you will find people ungrateful, rude, entitled. These guys, just a hell of a list.
That's the opening of Meditations, right?
Go.
Like that is for he to his credit. The first book is all about gratitude, but then when he gets to the actual book itself,
I still have a few things to say about really annoying people.
Everyone else sucks. Like these 20 people who help me are awesome, but everyone else fucking sucks. But even the rest of that quote, he goes like, "We're made to work with each other." He's like, "These people don't know what they're doing." He's like, they can't implicate me in ugliness. And he's like, my job is to put up with them and work with them. Like, it's funny, like the famous part is like how shitty everyone is. That's what everyone remembers. But he catches himself halfway through that paragraph,
Yeah.
and it ends on a very positive note to be patient and generous and collaborative, you know. So it's funny, like we see what we see the confirmation of like, yeah, people are that way, but what we kind of conveniently ignore is what he's saying we have to do with those people, which is be good to them, you know. Act as if Adam Smith said, you know, again, we think of Adam Smith as this like ruthless practitioner or philosopher of capitalism, but he also writes a book called A Theory of Moral Sentiments about like how we should be good people. But he basically says like, act as if there's an impartial observer following you everywhere, just going, you know, like to everything that you do. Like
little hall monitor with a
exactly
clipboard.
Just like, could you justify it to that person, you know? And a lot of times, like, they're not God or anything. He's just saying like, they're just watching. Like how much would you do? How much differently would you act if other people were watching? And it does kind of, I think, keep you honest.
Lead domino, let's call it, just to get fancy, that if tips over a lot of other things. And I will likely be doing this in the next year, probably in the next quarter. It's the 30-day no complaint experiment.
Yes. Mm-hmm. I think this is the first blog post you ever wrote.
It was a very early blog post. Yes. And if you want to change your life, you put a bracelet on, could be a rubber band, and every time you complain, you switch to the other wrist. It might be 21 days, but it's 3 or 4 weeks. And if you make a concerted effort to not complain at all and you achieve a solid, let's call it even 2 weeks without switching that bracelet, your quality of life will change completely. If you have some improvement, let's just say, that can be gained, which I would say is true for most people. And it's a forcing function for a lot of the Stoic practices.
It should be a rubber band, and then instead of switching, you just have that.
I wonder, you know, I suppose you could do it a whole bunch of ways. You could get like an Opus Dei, cat of nine tails. Might be a little awkward in said Starbucks if suddenly you bitch.
Samantha and I found that. So like, obviously we work together, and so, but we're not always together. So we would like get home in the afternoon or the evening, and we'd be like talking about like work stuff, right? And we realized like our kids thought we were fighting because like we weren't mad at each other, but we were both complaining / venting about stuff, right? And if you're a kid, you don't really understand what's happening. You're like, why is dad talking negatively to mom? And why is mom talking negatively to dad? None of the animus or the frustration was directed at each other, but it's the person we were communicating it to. Mm-hmm. And so it was like, we realized, one, we just shouldn't, well, like, first off, it's like, okay, let's not talk about work around the kids if that's how we're going to do it. And then second, it was like, this shouldn't be everything's going great. You know what I mean? Like at the end of the day, we're actually quite happy with everything, but we're just like picking to end the day by like ruminating on and complaining about all the things we don't like. Right? Mm-hmm. We're not setting aside and going, this happened well, and this happened well, and what about this? We're